Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson. This is the third and final lesson in this initial course on urban sketching. So if you remember, in the first couple of lessons we were working on these kind of very small tonal thumbnails. Second lesson we did this quick line sketch which took about 25 minutes or so, and this final one we're going to be making a larger tonal sketch, so kind of combining the two aspects of these previous lessons, the detail that we looked at in the line drawing, but going for more of a tonal study like we did in the first week. So if you remember, I was using just a collection of saved references from Unsplash, and I think I said the last couple of lessons you can of course work outdoors, work from any scene that you like, but if you're working indoors, this is a great resource, so I recommend having a look through. So last week we were looking for something quite something that lent itself to a line study, so we used this little reference here, but this week we're looking for something that has kind of larger general blocks of value. So looking through these, something like this one could work quite well, but with this one I wasn't entirely happy with how it looked in the thumbnail. Then we could look at something like this. You get a kind of nice intricate sort of detail in the church in the background. You get some sort of nice progressions. It is a little bit flat possibly for a tonal study. This one's possibly a bit too dark, so you're kind of weighing up what it is that will make it work well as a tonal study at this stage. And that's something that you kind of learn when you're doing these little tonal thumbnails. Some of them will look really good as a tonal study immediately, and you'll know that they'll work well when you actually do swap over and start working working on a larger piece. One that caught my attention last time actually for the tonal study was this one. Has some nice sort of forms. Has some trees, kind of like a mixture of things going on, which is quite cool. We could look at merging some of these shapes in the background, some of the building shapes, into groupings. So probably a toss-up between this one and this slightly more futuristic looking scene. I think I'll go for this more futuristic one. And I might allow it to kind of taper off, there'll be a bit of a vignette, but I think I'll work with this one. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to start kind of similar to the line drawing. I'm just going to get some of the major shapes in, but then start adding value rather than sticking to line. Again, I'm just going to be using a mechanical pencil, about 0.7 millimeter nib, or lead I should say. And I'm just going to work a similar scale to last week. Maybe slightly smaller, just because one of the limitations of maybe a bit kind of wider. One of the limitations of a tonal study is how quickly you can actually get your tone down. So I'm going to start just by kind of placing some stuff, getting a feel for what's going on in the landscape. Got these kind of railway lines that run across the lower section. Then behind that we have that kind of central building, which is going to be our focal point, sort of rises up. That building is kind of just made up of lots of nice solid planes, which is what made me think it might work quite well as a tonal study. Don't have to be too strict with the shapes. I'm not being entirely accurate. Obviously, a building like this could have different sorts of forms going on. But it's an interesting one. It's got a kind of almost organic quality to it, like it's a shell or something like that, which is nice. Some nice little bits. So I'm adding a reasonable amount of detail, or kind of planning out the detail of this section, just because it's going to be the focal point of the image. The rest of it, you'll notice that I won't be quite so fastidious. Then we've got there's a kind of shadow on this park next to it. Shadow of the building, which is quite a nice thing to discover in an image. Blocked by those railway lines. Then in front of the railway lines got another few buildings that kind of we can plot in. So I'm not being super strict with my perspective, and in something like this I wouldn't recommend it, just because you're either going to have to be really detailed with your perspective, or just not fuss too much over it, because there's so much going on with it that I wouldn't spend ages on. For a sketch, given that this is a sketch, you wouldn't want to spend ages working on it. We've got some sort of tree shapes, so I can be quite loose with these trees in the front and reaching up there as well. I'm actually shifting things around a little bit with this this sketch. I'm not using everything in the reference, and nor do you have to. One of the nice things about any kind of drawing, it's how much freedom you can have, so you don't feel like you have to copy exactly what's going on. Just using it as a sort of starting point, a reference point. Almost got our foreground sufficiently plotted in, which is good. Got another building sitting behind it, kind of more conventional building. And some more trees behind that again. Then we're going to start to get a little bit looser. We're almost at the end of our line sketching, because the rest of this is going to be tonal. We've got these kind of flatter buildings behind. They're in shadow as well. Then another one behind them, which is totally in shadow because they're sort of casting a shadow on it. behind that we've got some more buildings. They're further in the distance, so we'll be kind of loose with those. Again, they're kind of various stages of being in shadow or light. Then behind this one we've got kind of a skyline, which is going to be a bit looser. Mostly kind of rectangular buildings. Again, some trees. Got a lot of trees kind of intersecting everything, which is quite nice. Some more buildings in the background, but that pretty much does it for our sketch-in. So it's maybe at a similar sort of level when we first sketched in for this line drawing, but at this stage we're not going to add too much more detail in terms of line. We're just going to start figuring out relative values. So if I start with the darkest values, there's some dark shadows cast by these buildings. They kind of merge with the side of this one. So I'm looking through at all these shapes that I drew and just starting to shade them in one at a time, connect them where necessary. You can see it's quite different from last week. I'm just working with tone. We're not working with line at all. As things get further back, they can kind of be paler, their shadows, so I'm going to kind of come back in and reinforce a lot of the shadows in the foreground, because they'll tend to be darker. Pretty much the case with any setting, so in landscapes that's true as well. Trees will generally be quite dark, so the building's going to be a lot darker than the trees. So pretty much any tree, its average value can be darker, so I'm going to shade them in now. Got a lot of trees in the background here, and then we're going to add some extra shadows for them later on. got some shadows for the tops of these pillars holding up the railway bridge all the way along. But it's starting to kind of get there. Got some specific sort of shadow light shapes for these buildings in the back. But everything's kind of blocked. Oh, this one actually. Just about to say everything's blocked in, but this one's missing. So everything's getting there in terms of being blocked in. Got some little trees here actually. Just finish off. But I've roughly made everything a similar sort of value. So there's the shadow shapes and light shapes, but we wanna differentiate. So generally I want the sky to feel a little bit lighter than everything else. So I'm just gonna put a tone over pretty much every other part of the image except the lightest part of this central building, because I want that to stand out. So everything's going to have a little bit of shade over it, apart from this panel here and this panel here, which are both lighter parts of the main building, the kind of focal point of the image. But otherwise everything is separated from the sky. Then I'm going to go in and try to find kind of the darkest notes in the image. So we've got those things are going to be mostly in the foreground. So there's a little dark door just here. Oh, just realized I didn't shade in the shadow this building is casting. So that's going to be quite dark. We can add a little bit of a bedbug line to the edge of that building. The underside of this, I think it's a railway line, can be quite dark as well. We want that to be kind of reasonably pronounced. You can go in and find the shadow shapes of these trees. And then we also want to make any of the darkest parts of this central building fairly pronounced, because that'll make it stand out. Anywhere there's a lot of contrast will always stand out in any image. Doesn't matter what you're drawing or painting. Can add quite a lot of detail in this section as well, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time just fleshing out these details. So it's starting to come together, that central building, which is nice. Can go in and reinforce the darks in this building behind it as well, because it's kind of at a similar level in the image, so anything that sits at the same point, it's going to have a similar level of contrast. So I'm primarily just adding contrast into these foreground sections, and I'm not going to do too much in the background. I can leave the background quite loose. So I can add more detail to these trees. Shadows cast by them on the ground, that sort of thing. Can add a bit more detail to this other foreground building. This bit more kind of shadow contrast to this bridge. To the darker parts of these trees. And darken out some of these shadows. I might just kind of progressively darken some of these other buildings in, I suppose, the mid-ground. Or the darker parts of them, at least. Not all the building, obviously. Can use some of these shapes, kind of shadowy parts of the buildings behind, just to frame the exact kind of shape of that lighter section. Now that it's been more tonal, those initial light shapes that I used less, or not light shapes, but those line drawing that I put in is becoming less evident. So I might just finish it off by picking out some really dark accents in this focal point building. So similar to last week where we were using kind of clusters of lines, or kind of more detail in terms of line, to catch the eye. In this one we're going to use, because it's tonal, we're going to use more contrast. So I'm just going to put my very darkest sections of the drawing kind of around this central building, just to draw the viewer's attention to it even more so. Yeah, something like that's not too bad. So that's the kind of level of detail that you'd want to go for with a little tonal study like this. You can see how much more we focused on tone over line. So where last week we were looking at kind of just building up detail in terms of line, this week we've gone a lot more tonal. And you can build it even more, so you could develop kind of greater levels of tonal development through the image. Actually, just what I think about it, I think the grass is probably slightly, makes sense the grass isn't quite so light. So I'm just going to darken that out across the image. Which helps to bring the central building to the fore again. So it's all about finding that kind of balance of contrast, relationships in terms of values, just to make sure you're foregrounding or kind of drawing attention to the parts of the image that are most important. So in this case, I want this building to feel like the central part of the image. So that's what we've done. But yeah, that's pretty much it. And that's the final in this series on urban sketching. We're going to get back into it next term as well. We'll be looking at different types of colour washes, maybe working in pen, watercolours, that sort of thing. So different ways of approaching it, building on these skills. So you could do a line sketch that you then do a wash over, or you can build up your tone differently. So you can build up your tone with watercolours or Letraset markers or Copic markers, all sorts of things. But yeah, that's it for this week. Hopefully it was a useful lesson for you guys. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you want a high level of support, follow the link through to OCAD's page and sign up to OCAD Studio. But yeah, that's it for today. I will see you guys soon.